LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat and my guest today is Andy Duncan, who joins us to discuss the forthcoming Scottish Independence Referendum, which is taking place on Thursday, 18th September 2014. The prospect of Scotland breaking away from the rest of the United Kingdom has always been controversial and divisive. For every argument in favour of such a move, there has been a counter-argument warning of the dangers of secession. Debates about what currency an independent Scotland would use, how it would pay its bills, which army would defend it, and whether it could or should become a member of the European Union have raged constantly, now kicked into high gear as the referendum itself draws near. The politicians and mainstream media, however, have frequently presented little more than propaganda and misinformation on the matter, leaving much of the general Scottish public to make a truly momentous decision based on inadequate and often misleading information. If Scotland votes no, it may be the death knell for dreams of independence. If she votes yes, however, a series of exciting, risky and potentially life-changing decisions lie ahead. Could Scotland become a Singapore of the North, attracting a flood of investment and development with low tax rates? Or will she join the EU, adopt the euro and lose her new independence under the boot of new masters? In the end, the stakes are just as high for the rest of the UK. If Scotland votes yes, the wider political landscape will change forever. Hello and welcome, Andy, and thank you so much for joining us again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, it's great to be with you again, Greg.
Now, today, Andy, we're going to talk about the forthcoming Scottish Independence Referendum and how that overlaps and intersects with UK politics in general. Before we dive into that, just tell listeners a little bit about yourself. Just give them a potted bio.
Well, I've got into doing a bit of podcasting myself recently. I've been doing some work with Casey Research for a while. And before that, I was doing some podcasting for Gold Money. And then I did some work for a place called the Cobden Centre in the UK. It's all basically from an Austrian libertarian, anarcho-capitalist position. It's very lonely, as you probably know, being a libertarian in the UK. There's not that many of us. And most of us all have wildly divergent views, but I'm very much in the what you might call the Mises, Rothbard camp, maybe with a bit of Hopper as well. And there aren't that many of us in this country. There's probably 4 or 5 of us, maybe a few more. And so I just do what I can, whenever I can, to promote that message. And for a living, I lecture on financial derivatives. But that's, it's just a job like any other.
When it comes to personal politics, I can't affiliate myself with any group or any ism. I just say I want truth and freedom, and that automatically cancels out virtually everything that's out there.
Well, I think that's what we're all looking for, aren't we? I mean, I don't actually like the word anarchist because it has so many negative connotations. I much prefer the kind of phrase, the totally voluntary society. All I'm looking for is a society where people do what they voluntarily agree to do and don't ever have guns put to their heads to force them to do what someone else wants them to do.
Quite. Okay, well, on to this Scottish Independence Referendum. Now, this is due to take place on Thursday, 18th September this year. Following an agreement between the Scottish Government, and just a lot of people probably overseas are not aware of this, there is actually a Scottish Government and Parliament at the minute, but it's just a devolved assembly, a bit like what they have in Wales and Northern Ireland. But following this agreement between the Scottish Government and the UK Government down in Westminster, the Scottish Independence Referendum Bill was put forward on the 21st of March last year, 2013, passed by the Scottish Parliament on 14th November last year, received royal assent, that wasn't that nice of her, on 17th of December last year. And the referendum question, actually very simple, as recommended by the Electoral Commission, what would we do without them? The question is, should Scotland be an independent country? Now, when I heard that this was going ahead, I was somewhat surprised because I remember Alex Salmond back in the early 90s when I was a student studying politics cropping up, and he's back again. I didn't actually think a referendum would ever go ahead, a bit like the EU one, should the UK opt out of the European Union? That's been talked about for as long as I can remember, still hasn't happened. What were your thoughts when they actually said, right, this is green lighted, this is actually going ahead?
Well, I was as surprised as you were. I think Alex Salmond's taken a great kind of risk here, but it's a risk I think he has to take. It will be a tremendous thing if Scotland does go independent. I'm very much a believer in secession. I don't think it's going to happen. I think there's going to be too many no's in the end. Scotland does have a lot of British government jobs. It has a lot of people there on British government pensions. And people, without thinking about the morality of where that money's coming from, will tend to vote with their wallets. However, in the last few days, I've been thinking that maybe the yes might win, because if people wake up on the Friday morning and they voted no, they're going to feel a bit kind of sad, and maybe they don't want to feel sad. So maybe when they go into the polling station with the intention of voting no, the emotions of Braveheart and Mel Gibson and Sean Connery, and waking up the next day having voted no and feeling bad, might actually make people vote yes and take a chance. Why not? It's a momentous occasion, and I really hope I'm wrong with my prediction that the no's will win. And I'm really, really kind of hoping and praying that the yes vote does win.
Well, I'd actually like to see it go ahead as well. And I should say at this point, clearly to most people, I would have thought neither of us is Scottish, though I can trace my lineage back, I suppose, to the Clan Moffat. But there's a lot of important issues here, and if this was to go to the yes camp, this would be a crucial precedent, really. Well, I think it would be. There could be a lot of ramifications outside of the UK. So let's just have a little thought experiment. Let's just say they manage to pull it off. What happens then, as you say, every time people arrive at the office at 9 a.m. Monday morning? Because I wonder how many preparations have been made for the possibility of a yes. It's difficult to tell.
Well, most governments generally only give you a choice on something when they know that the outcome is in their favour. So again, it is a surprise that the British government let this happen, because all governments want to be big, and they want to be bigger, because the bigger they are, the more territory they control, the more powerful they are, and the more that the leaders, say the British Prime Minister, can swank around the world in a jet making big, huge foreign policy kind of announcements. But if it just becomes England and Wales and then England, then the Prime Minister of England isn't going to have so much kind of clout in the world. And so most governments won't usually give you a choice. So they probably thought that it would be 60% no, 40% yes. But the polls in the last few days are maybe starting to frighten the people in Westminster. So the ramifications, if the yes do win, I think that Wales will be next. Wales has been a principality of England now for about 800 years. And I think that if Scotland wins and goes independent, I think that the Welsh might kind of wake up and say, why not us too? And then, who knows how it'll go. I think the Scottish secession has to be a success. I think that they mustn't do what I think they might do. With Alex Salmond and the SNP being mostly a socialist organisation, and not being somebody who lives in Scotland, or not entirely, I don't know everything about them, I have a horrible feeling that they'll just go straight into the EU and just become an area of the Eurozone with the euro as a currency. But if they do the right thing and they do actually stand as an independent country, even though they want to be more socialist, being small, like Hong Kong or Singapore or anywhere small, will force them to have to be more free market orientated. And that will make Scotland a much more enterprising, entrepreneurial country, and will actually suck in entrepreneurs from the outside. So English entrepreneurs will move to Scotland. And just like in the Scottish Enlightenment, Scotland will become a cradle of liberty and ideas and things if they do the right thing. I'm absolutely terrified of the SNP just dragging Scotland straight into the Eurozone, adopting the euro, and just becoming another area of the EU SSR empire. But if they do actually stand alone, it will be tremendous. England will become a much less significant political world force. Wales might try and raise itself up and throw off the yoke of England brought in by Edward I. Scotland will become a tremendously dynamic, enterprising country with a much, much smaller government for reasons we might be able to discuss later on. Who knows? London might want to go independent. They see Scotland becoming very entrepreneurial, very enterprising, very wealthy within 10 years. And the people of London might think, well, if Scotland's done so well out of going independent, we're big enough to be a country. Why don't we go independent? And then, unfortunately, it's very heavily tied into welfare. But maybe then Cornwall might decide to finally become the Republic of Kernow. Who knows where it might go? One day, I hope that Henley-on-Thames in Oxfordshire will be an independent city-state, and I will be the freely acknowledged leader of the city-state. So who knows where it'll go?
I don't know if you've ever seen the American series Family Guy, but in one episode there, Peter takes his house and garden and declares it a republic.
I always love that film. Is it Passport to Pimlico and other 1960s films like the Mouse That Roared, about that tiny country where Peter Sellers is the president. But yes, it would be fantastic if we broke down. I mean, if you look at Germany sort of 200 years ago when it was hundreds of little Germanys, 100 to 200 little countries, tremendously enterprising. You know, there's Gutenberg's press, there's Beethoven, there's Mozart, there's no copyright in music, so there's an explosion in music, explosion in culture, and then you've got this horrible, heavy Prussian sledgehammer, which the Prussians killed the King of Bavaria to bring Bavaria under the jackboot of Prussia, and then crushed the life out of Germany. So if we can cantonize everywhere and become, like hundreds of little Switzerlands and Hong Kongs and Singapores and Liechtensteins and Andorras and Monacos, I think it will be fantastic. I mean, why Scotland? Why not Shetland as a free independent country? Why not the Orkneys as a free independent country? Why not the Highlands as an independent country? Why not, Edinburgh as a city-state? I mean, it could go down and down and down, and that's eventually where I hope it will go.
Well, of course, just as not everyone in Scotland wants Scotland to be independent, that's obviously clear. Not everyone in England, and everyone who's English and lives in England, wants Scotland to stay as part of the Union or even want. And there is a movement for English independence as well.
Yeah, that's there's lots of polls around, but from the people I know, and I don't really being a believer in a totally voluntary society that thinks government is nothing more than a very well entrenched and a very long-lived mafia. I don't really follow politics that much because to me that's just following the gossip of the mafia bosses. But my general feeling is that most people would be happy to see Scotland go independent and would actually like to see Scotland go independent because Alex Salmond's been very, very clever. He's used the Barnett formula, which has basically meant that people in Scotland get more tax spent on them per head than everyone else in England. And he's used that extra money from the Barnett formula, that extra tax revenue from the British government, to fund things to deliberately annoy the English. So giving students, free fees at university and various other measures like that. And I think that's been partially to annoy the English, and it has worked. And I don't think there'll be any great love lost if Scotland does leave the Union, except amongst the political class. All the tax eaters and all the political intelligentsia who mostly get paid far more than they're actually worth in the market, so therefore love government and mostly work for government or various other tax-paid organisations. All the tax eaters will be horrified because when you lose your tax base, you lose the excuse for existing and for having these huge bureaucracies. I mean, can you imagine a city-state with a massive bureaucracy for education? It just doesn't work, but it does work for the United Kingdom. So I think the tax-eating class in England will be horrified about Scotland leaving the Union, but I think the net tax-paying class will be completely happy to see Scotland go independent.
There's a good point worth reinforcing that you made not that long ago, which is that Scotland going independent and joining the EU, being part of the EU is not independence. And arguably, it could be less independent than they are now in some ways, because there's been some resistance put up. Obviously, the UK hasn't got the euro, and there's been some resistance put up over the years by the government to not accepting every diktat that comes out of Brussels.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is Nigel Farage's argument from the UK Independence Party. He's actually perversely against Scottish independence. And the reason why is because, probably astutely, he says that Alex Salmond, being a socialist, I think, will take Scotland into the EU SSR more deeply, will adopt the euro, and just become an area within the Eurozone, basically just a fiefdom of Brussels. So that is a danger, because the problem with socialism, of course, is it needs a bigger area to mask all the problems. The other thing is they're going to lose a central bank. So unless they come up with a new currency, the Scottish pound or something, if they're going to use the pound, they're going to have to use a currency board. They might use the euro. Let's say they stay out of the eurozone and don't use the ECB's facilities. Let's just say they have a currency board to track the euro. I think it's probably likely that they'll go with tracking the pound with a currency board, but with no central bank. What that means is there's no one to buy up the government's debt with counterfeited new money. So if you can't counterfeit new money to buy government debt, then governments are going to be limited by the spending and are going to be limited by the economy. So if the economy has a down, and it'll have ups and downs, then they'll have to live on their taxation revenue, because they won't be able to sell Scottish government bonds, because nobody will buy them, because there won't be a Scottish central bank to monetize and print money out of thin air, counterfeited money, to buy up that debt. So no one will want Scottish debt except at a very high premium, 10-15% interest. So therefore they won't be able to issue that debt. So the Scottish government will have to live within its means of its taxation. That will mean government in Scotland will shrink massively without this extra facility of being able to print money out of thin air. It's a bit like you have to diet, don't you? So you imagine if you had a machine that could just soak away extra fat from your body at the press of a button, and somebody takes away that button, then you're going to have to stop eating so much. So the government is going to shrink massively in Scotland if they track the pound with a currency board and don't have a central bank. And that will be amazing for Scotland's entrepreneurial spirit. Unfortunately, I think this is what will drive Scotland and its socialist kind of thinking straight into the hands of the EU SSR.
Yeah, of course, what the general scenario you've been setting out there, not like joining the EU, but all that stuff beforehand, is a good thing. But it says something about the world we live in and how conditioned we are, that there will be people listening to this who probably tuned out after a couple of lines and just started going, oh no, that will be terrible, because this government gravy train would then come off the rails, and that they immediately just start thinking about immediate effects on them and those around them. And that's understandable. It's a human thing to do, but it's not like, for example, the UK as it stands at the minute is some kind of paragon of excellence and efficiency.
Yeah, I mean, the tax-eating class, I mean, they're generally very well paid. I'm just making something up here. Let's say I'm a regulator in Edinburgh. I'm a VAT regulator of some kind. I'm on 50,000 current pounds a year. My job is mostly useless, and it basically is going around taking money off other people and cramping other people's lives. If I'm working for a government which can't afford to pay for me, I get sacked. Oh dear. I'm now going to have to go and find a real job in the private marketplace. I've been used to sort of, loafing around an office and having nice holidays and getting well paid. I'm now going to have to work for a living. So instead of eating tax, I'm now going to be a taxpayer. That means I'm going to change my politics, being someone who's now a net taxpayer rather than a net tax eater. And so, although I'm horrified at the moment, it will be good for me in 10 years' time. But I don't want to see past losing my really cushy number working, well, we call it work. It's sitting around in a government office, phoning my friends, checking Facebook, playing with Google Maps, and occasionally harassing people with basically a gun to their head, making them do stuff to justify your existence. So I think it'd be a fantastic thing if Scotland goes independent and loses the central bank and the government shrinks. But, there's probably hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland on very nice salaries in the political intelligentsia tax-eating class who are absolutely horrified by the thought of working in the private enterprise market.
And it's also worth saying at this stage, when people are done thinking about their immediate circumstances, this overall system that we're characterizing that sort of dominates the West and lots of other parts of the world as well, this and even the US is increasingly going down this route. that in itself is not sustainable long term. We see that now. We only have to study the global economic system to know that this is going to crash and burn at some stage. So if Scotland did opt to be, the phrase I think you used was Singapore of the North or whatever, they would actually get the march on everywhere else, and they might have to suck it up, bite a bullet, whatever, some bitter medicine. But in the long term, they're going to end up there anyway.
Yes, they're going to have to give up the heroin of government money out of thin air, and giving up heroin for any heroin addicts. Just watch the Train Spotting movie set in Edinburgh, of course. Giving up heroin is hard, and any heroin addict who's been taking heroin for a while would hate to give up heroin. But take the heroin away for a year, and they're going to be cleaner, fitter, healthier. They're not going to enjoy the process, and they don't want to do it, but they will be a lot better off. It reminds me of something from many years ago in Hong Kong. What a lot of Chinese would do under the old kind of Maoist communist days is they'd swim the shark-infested water. 1 in 10 would make it past the sharks and actually get to Hong Kong. But when they got there, they just stuck out, a rice bowl and expected to be fed. They were indolent and lazy, and they were useless as employees. But people would take them on because within 2 years, these people from the former Maoist communist China weren't indolent anymore. They were the hardest working, most entrepreneurial people in Hong Kong, and they drove the economy. And it usually took them about 2 years to adjust from this handout, the world owes me a living mentality, to working for themselves and being very, very dynamic. And I think the same would happen in Scotland. Hundreds of thousands of useless, well, worse than useless government regulators who make a living by hampering other people's activities would be that foot would be taken off the throat of Scotland. That weight would be lifted, and all those people who'd be thrown on the dole for a while would become much more enterprising, much more entrepreneurial. They'd have to find a living in a voluntary world where people want their services rather than being forced to use their government services. And so Scotland would have this weight taken off with the government regulation, and they'd also have a driving force from behind. These people eventually, after 2 years or so, switching round and becoming dynamic. So you get these two massive effects to really lift the Scottish economy. I hope it happens. I pray that I'm wrong in my prediction that Scotland will vote no. If they vote yes, it will be fantastic, so long as Salmon doesn't just take them straight into the Eurozone.
Now, since the financial crash of 07-08, some legitimate private enterprise has suffered, just as the general economy has. This might resonate with other people in different parts of the UK and indeed elsewhere in the developed world. There are two types of buildings in my city, two types of organisations, should I say, that appear to be completely unaffected by the recession. And in fact, I mentioned buildings because they've been splashing out on refurbishing, and in the case of the local council, the most extravagant 5-storey brand new building for all their employees. And the other category of business is the banks. They've been refurbishing, and you go into the interior of any of the mainline banks now, it's very swish. I've been down at the council offices. I have to go down there, unfortunately, from time to time because they keep demanding money from me with menaces. Now, I understand council tax pays for services. I do want to have a sewage service. I do want to have roads. That's a whole other thing we could discuss some other day. And indeed, we did discuss actually in a previous interview that you and I did. We were discussing, anarcho-capitalism. But anyway, it's just really telling when you go down there, the number of people standing around the water cooler. I see people on Facebook kind of just standing around wondering. And yeah, there's some people typing away, some people going to and fro with bundles of papers. But there's a hell of a lot of people in there, and it's not immediately clear what they're all doing on any given day if you're in there.
Well, they have to justify their existence, so they do a little bit of what they call, I'm using quote marks here, work. But that work generally consists of harassing people. So they'll be loafing around, they'll rock up at 9:30, they'll take 2-hour lunches and leave at 3:30, have long weekends and take lots of sickies. But, they will occasionally do something, and that's usually going after people for breaking regulations. So they'll be given targets and quotas to stimulate them. So some kind of regulator will be told to find 40 people who are breaking the regulation every 6 months and to find them. And if they can find 40 people and find them, then that's just been a success, and they might even get a promotion, which I think is very strange, of course, because these people are employed supposedly by us. we pay their wages and they make their living by basically harassing us and making our lives worse. I've always found this very, very weird. Of course, they don't really work for us. They are the rulers and we are the ruled. And we can talk about that at some other time or today, if you like. But they do have to do something. And you say the banks are different from the government. I don't think they are. I think the banks are part of the government machine. I think it was Ludwig von Mises who said, he'd hate to see the bankers get together with the government. The reason governments look after the banks with fractional reserve banking and so on is because the banks are the ones who are selling the government debt to enable the government to keep spending. This is why the governments were horrified about the banks going under in 2007. I mean, I would have just let them go. What we'd have now is RBS would have gone, HBOS and Halifax would have gone, Northern Rock would have gone. The assets would still have existed. What we would have cleared out, though, is 3 useless managements. And those useless managements would have had to go off and find other jobs in other professions, being tennis coaches or whatever. And then new businesses would have come up from the ashes, the smoking ashes of those big businesses. The employees would have found other work. I mean, even now, virtually everyone who worked for Lehman Brothers has, moved on to get other work and other jobs, mostly in the banking industry. But the governments were terrified of the banks going down because then nobody would have been peddling their debt and nobody would have been helping give them money so that they can spend money they haven't got to buy votes and buy these fantastic palaces that all these bureaucrats love putting themselves in. You've got organisations like the BBC, of course, they never feel any pain because they have their own private tax, which is the BBC licence fee. They've got creches for their staff and they've got these lovely pension arrangements and these lovely buildings and mood rooms and all the other things that you very, very rarely see in real private sector places.
Now, all of this is, of course, relevant to the Scottish independence debate, vis-a-vis what direction they go in if the Yes camp pull through. Talking about how this has all been presented to the public, I mean, the amount of propaganda and misinformation in this campaign has been staggering, and it's not just all come from the no side, but it's all been so opaque, particularly for people who don't follow politics and economics on a regular basis. And for such a momentous decision being made with such inadequate information, to me, is staggering. Now, again, some people will be voting yes and they don't understand any of the fundamentals. Some people will vote no without understanding any of the fundamentals. But listening to the mainstream media in this country, it's been very difficult, I think, for your average Joe on the street, unless he goes on the internet and educates himself, to actually figure out what the hell is going on. Because like a lot of debate in this country, both sides come on. One says it's black, here's the proof. The other side says it's white, here's the proof. The presenter says, well, we'll just have to wind it up now, I'm afraid, because we're out of time. This debate will run and run. And the person listening is going, well, one of them's lying. Which is it? And they're none the wiser.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it, with this kind of news by soundbite. I'm giving away my age now, but in the 1970s, even the BBC, God love them. I mean, they'd have programs like Horizon, and a program like Horizon was very intellectual. It would do a long story about something that was really, really interesting. But Horizon became more and more politicized over the years. Panorama and other programs became very, very, very politicized, and everything turned into sound bites and snap judgments and people shouting at each other. So Newsnight, I used to watch Newsnight many years ago, and it used to be, debates between gentle people, gentle women and gentlemen. But trying to watch it now, it just Kirsty Walk. It starts off a slanging match. There's 5 minutes of a slanging match, and then it's over. And I think it's because the chattering classes, this political intelligentsia, this elite, most of whom work in some form of government body, most of whom are tax eaters, most of whom live off tax of everyone else, of the net taxpayers, they're horrified to see Scotland go independent. So I think that they are deliberately clouding the argument. And this is why governments need intellectuals on their side. Governments are not that strong. I mean, you saw this massively strong government in the Soviet Union, But once it gave up the will to shoot people for not obeying its diktats, it crumbled away within 5 or 6 years and just disappeared. So very, very strong governments need intellectual support from the intelligentsia. How they get that intellectual support, and the intellectuals would go around in Scotland, for instance, telling everyone who hasn't got time to follow the arguments, vote no, it's the sensible thing to do. What the intelligentsia do is that, and in return for that, they generally get very good salaries, far in excess of what they would earn in the private market, as university professors, BBC news announcers, government regulators of one form or another. So that's the quid pro quo here. If government needs intellectual support, it takes taxpayer money, it funnels it into what the intelligentsia wants to do, and then the intellectuals then persuade everyone else to follow the government and do what the government wants. And if that could be broken, if ordinary people can rise up and break through that propaganda, that management by news bite, by very, very snap judgments, and if you can go back to 1707 and figure out why Scotland got sucked into the English ambit in the first place, that was another project which was the Scottish elite soaking up all the money in Scotland, giving themselves a company, making it a monopoly so that it was the only company that could do trade, import-export trade with Scotland and the rest of the world. Even with that monopoly, which, it would be nice to have if you didn't have any morals, they still blew it because they wasted all their money on the Darien project in Panama. I don't know how many ships they sent down there, 20 or 30 ships filled with people. Everyone died of disease or got killed by the Spanish. And the Scottish elite were going to be poverty-stricken. So what they did is they sold Scotland down the river and they sold it to England. So we have Robert the Bruce. We've got Mel Gibson in Braveheart with his blue and white face, dying horribly in London. We then have Robert the Bruce, and we have Bannockburn in 1314. Try again. Keep the English out. Stop them taking over our country. And then in 1707, the whole of Scotland just sold down the river just to bail out. It's just like the banking crisis of 2007. The bankers were bailed out. Same thing in 1707. The Scottish elite bankers were bailed out by the English, and in return, the English got Scotland after 1,000 years of trying to get Scotland. If people can just go back to that, the fact that Scotland never willingly went into under English control in the first place, then maybe they'll be able to see through all this propaganda from a self-serving political elite mainly based in Edinburgh.
Well, talking about battles, another arena in which this debate has been conducted is with regards to defence, and with the no camp, whether in Scotland or coming out of the UK government, saying that, of course, Scotland then won't have its own military, like Scotland needs some huge military, and the American air bases going, what are you going to do? As if there are other people, state actors or other organisations lining up to invade Scotland or attack it in some other way as soon as it's cut off from the precious UK military.
Well, Ireland manages to survive without a massive military, and Norway does, and Denmark without a massive military. Even the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands manage to survive without a massive military. And here's the thing, of course. Scottish regiments are the backbone of the British Army, and whenever there's any real trouble in the world, who do they send in first? I mean, they send in the SAS and the Paratroop Regiment and the Marines, but a lot of paratroopers are Scottish, a lot of Marines are Scottish, and everyone I've ever met from the SAS tends to have been from Glasgow. They send in the Scottish regiments because they're the toughest soldiers in the world. Nobody in their right mind would try to invade Scotland, even if they could get round Denmark and Sweden and Norway and Ireland and England and everywhere else. It's absolutely ridiculous. Scotland would have one of the finest, would have a small professional army of some of the finest regiments of soldiers in the world that people would be terrified of. 3/4 of the SAS are probably Scottish. They would relocate to Scotland somewhere rather than Hereford. It's just a nonsense, absolute nonsense. It's like all the buildings would crumble, all those military bases would crumble in Scotland if the English kind of yoke is taken away. Of course that wouldn't happen. And Ireland survives, and Switzerland survives, and Norway survives without massive armies. Scotland would be absolutely fine.
That's another point worth making that is really obvious, but some people I don't know what they imagine would happen, but if there was a yes vote, as you say, all the assets, including buildings and roads, they're all still there. It's not that Scotland suddenly has nothing. one of the main issues has been talking about the currency. Again, reinforcing the fact, reminding us, how this world of phantom money out of nothing has come to dominate everything else in the world. And it really shouldn't be like that, but that's the way it is. So people are talking about whether their notes and coins are going to have the Queen's head on or not, without focusing on what they actually do have, including North Sea oil. But that's another thing we can come on to, of course, because that's been hotly contested as to how valuable that still is.
Well, Brenda will still be the Queen of Scotland, won't she? I mean, it was James VI of Scotland who became James I of England. So I think she'll still be the Queen of Scotland. And the money thing, most people don't understand money, especially economists and especially bankers. I mean, as somebody who makes my living going around teaching people about financial derivatives and with a background in Austrian economics, I am simply amazed. When I explain fractional reserve banking to people from a Rothbardian position using the Mystery of Banking as my main text, the people in banks at quite senior levels are just absolutely amazed and horrified how it works. So most people in banks don't understand how the monetary system works. So it's very difficult for people to understand it. But it is just a fiction. It is the man behind the green curtain pulling the magic lever. We need to go back to real money. Now, I can't see this happening with Scotland. I mean, obviously, as a believer in a totally voluntary society, I want people to use whatever money they want to use. And I think that would end up being a combination of gold and silver and Bitcoin and whatever else people want to use, coconuts if they want to use coconuts. But let's kind of be realistic about where they're going to go. They can create a new central bank and they can create what the Irish had a pound for a long time, the punt. They could create a Scottish pound. I mean, even now, people, I really dislike going to Glasgow and Edinburgh airports and using cash because they give you Scottish notes and they're just about, with the Royal Bank of Scotland on them and Bank of Scotland, and they're just about impossible to get rid of in England. People just won't take them. So the Scottish pound, whatever they call it, we can maybe think of a name for that later. They could do that.
Call it a haggis, I suppose.
Oh, yeah. What stereotype of your choice? Or they could call it the clay. Actually, the claymore might be quite a nice name.
Actually, we'll put dibs on that now and take credit if it happens.
Yeah, the claymore. I think it'd be good. I don't think they'll go there. I think that might be a bit too complicated for them. I think most people in Scotland would like to keep or use the British pound. They've kind of grown up with it and they're used to it. And it's got the Queen's head on it. You can use a pound. I mean, the people in Panama use the US dollar. They don't ask permission of the American government to do that. And a lot of people in South America, of course, use the American dollar. And the people in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe used to use the Deutschmark and or the dollar. So you can use the pound, but you're not going to be able. The reason all that the intellectuals are horrified by this is because the government won't be able to print money out of thin air to buy its own debt. And if it can't buy its own debt, it's going to have to live within its means. And what that means is it's going to have to sack lots of the intellectuals from their nice cushy numbers in all these massive government bureaucracies. That's why the intellectuals are so terrified of the Scottish government living within its means. But you can use the pound. Anyone can use the pound. I can go to Hong Kong and use the pound. They just won't be able to print counterfeit money out of thin air at will, like the Bank of England does for its masters in the UK Treasury. And so they'll probably go with a currency board for the pound. They might go with a currency board for the euro, where they track the euro. They have lots of euros and they use those. But I have a horrible feeling that the SNP will try to introduce the euro and just turn Scotland into part of the eurozone. That, to me, would be the worst option, and that's what Nigel Farage is terrified, of course.
Well, just you talk about you don't have to ask permission. It's still, I mean, the euro and the pound are what's the euro at the minute? Is it like about 80 something p, something like that? Mm-hmm. It's not uncommon for businesses close to the Irish border, for example, to accept either. If that's all people have got, they're not going to quibble, particularly if it's a substantial purchase. It's kind of like, yeah, whatever. And so, yeah, you're right. And that again is another something that seems counterintuitive to people. But of course, as you mentioned, US dollars accepted everywhere. And you go somewhere in the Middle East, and the chances are they know what gold and silver are. These days, I always carry a 1 ounce of silver around with me, and the number of times people have said, "What is that?" Well, they know it's a coin. But I tell them it's silver, and don't even go down that route. We'll be here all day. But in some places in the world, it's whatever. In the same way that in in millennia gone by, there was sticks with notches on them and, pebbles or whatever it happened to be. That doesn't need to be a problem, as you've just said.
Yeah, in Turkey, I mean, I'm very lucky to be going to Professor Hans Hermann Hopper's conference in Bodrum in a couple of weeks. Everything there is done in euros. I mean, you don't need to use Turkish lira at all. I mean, everyone there is quite happy to take euros. Here's the thing. Everyone in Scotland can still have a pound bank account. Every bank in Scotland can have pound bank accounts. I mean, they had this in Iceland, of course. You could even go to Carlisle or Newcastle or Berwick-upon-Tweed and I'm sure a bank in Berwick-upon-Tweed will let you have an account in pounds, and then you can insist that your employer pays you in pounds. They'll be fine with that. They'll take in their revenue in pounds. A Scottish import company or export company will sell its goods abroad. It will usually be transacting in dollars and euros. It can turn those into pounds, and then pay its staff in pounds with their pound bank account with a bank in Carlisle. It's or even a bank in Glasgow. It's ridiculous that this is even an issue. It's an issue though for everyone connected with the government, because the Scottish government is going to have to live within the taxation it takes in, and that puts tremendous discipline upon any government. And governments hate discipline. They love just being able to spend whatever they want on whatever they want, and so this discipline will force them to cut back. And then we'll get a shrunken government. And as I said earlier, that will take the foot off the throat of the Scottish economy, and then give it a kick up the bum as well, because all those people who were regulators will now be working properly for a living.
Talking about the banks again, that was another threat that was waved around, that some of the big banks based with their headquarters in Edinburgh mostly would then all shut down and leave, basically. And they had a couple of senior bankers go on record kind of saying, yeah, well, we'll have to consider it. And there's other private businesses that have been dragged into this argument, other companies headquartered in Scotland, that would they then leave, because it wouldn't be, all sorts of incentives would suddenly vanish. But as we're talking here, it doesn't have to be like that. And Scotland would be free. It's got some leverage at the minute, but it would be then free to offer much more favourable conditions if it wanted to for certain types of businesses.
Yeah, if they put corporation tax down to zero, if they put the income tax rate to 10%, if they take VAT down to zero, I mean, obviously all these things hurt the government. I'm not saying it won't hurt the government, but to me that's great. That's hurting the mafia. But bring corporation tax down to 0%. Well, all the companies in England will migrate to Scotland. I'll go to Scotland. I'll be very happy to live in Glasgow or Edinburgh or somewhere around there, and maybe Dunblane. I've got some friends in Dunblane. I know some nice curry houses in Dunblane. I'll go and live in Dunblane. I'll pay 10% income tax. I'll charge no VAT on my invoices. I'll pay no corporation tax with my business. There will be a massive influx of people into Scotland if they do it properly. What it is, of course, is, again, we've got the SNP government, socialist government. They just want to raise taxes and spend more money so they can be loved and voted for. But it will, or could be, the other way round. Scotland will suck in people from the rest of Europe who are tired of French regulations. The old alliance will come back into play. They'll suck in a lot of people from Cumbria and Northumberland and the north of England who'll get away from the taxation there. But they're going to have to rethink things. They're going to have to make Scotland an attractive place for business. And this is why the smaller a country goes, the better, because it can't support socialism. It can't support those islands of chaos which socialism generates. So you look at any small country, Singapore, Hong Kong, Andorra, Monaco, the cantons of Switzerland, they're all wealthy. The people there are independent. Scotland could go that way instead of being this kind of mass of people dependent upon the government. And people just forget, of course. They think, I heard an advert on the radio the other day. It makes me feel a bit ill, actually. Free childcare from the government. And people think, great, isn't the government wonderful? It's giving me this free childcare. Well, your child is going to be indoctrinated for 15 hours a week by a government licensed government indoctrinator. And where does that money come from? It comes from the wages that you're earning while your child's in childcare. They give you childcare so you can go out and earn more tax for them. That's why they're doing it. And also to get your vote, of course. So people think there's this cornucopia of goodness called the government, but all that money's taken from other people. Most of the money disappears along the way. And then you end up with something worse, queuing at the other end and begging for the things that you've paid for. So I think, in education in the UK, I mean, I'm sort of making up these numbers, but I'm just going from memory. I think that a state school place costs the taxpayer something like about £8,000 a year. Now, what you get at the end of that is you get something that's worth £3,000. About £5,000 disappears in the massive bureaucracies, all the local education authorities and everything else. If you gave people a choice in England of saying, or Scotland of saying, right, okay, you can either have the state education for free or we'll give you £8,000 a year, I think most people would take the £8,000 a year and educate their children privately in Montessori schools or with home teaching or traditional private schools rather than go through the state system. But the state won't offer that, of course, because it likes having that extra £5,000 a year to spend in these local education authorities and all the other government bureaucracies and the Department of Education with its 40, 50,000 employees. We could get rid of all of that by just saying, have your money back if you want to. So people think this government is a wonderful thing because it gives you this free stuff. Everybody forgets that free stuff comes from other people. I think it was Mencken who said, no, it wasn't Mencken, it was Nietzsche. Nietzsche says everything the government has, it has stolen, it even bites with stolen teeth.
Yeah, I mean, nothing's free. Is it just a question of who pays for it? I think that's the nub of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, another thing that annoys me is the pretend free things that you get in the real world, like pizza $7.99 with free glass of wine, and it's like no, it's not. You're charging me $7.99 for a pizza and a glass of wine. The wine is not free.
Well, people can use psychology, can't they, to get you to eat bad food?
Yeah. I think actually you mentioned tax regimes. I think that's why, as far as I remember, that's why there were so many rock stars, or are so many rock stars in the Irish Republic. Because they created a little incentive for them. Basically, if you made your living through music or whatever, you paid this nominal amount of tax. Because those are some of the big earners in the world. Just like the rest of the rich and famous, I suppose.
Yeah, government often turns down the obvious solution, which is to cut itself. For instance, you take a city like Detroit, which I think is in Michigan in the United States, on the St. Lawrence Seaway between two of the Great Lakes. If the it's a disaster area, and it used to be a fantastic place, and now it's a disaster area. All they have to do to fix that is just say, right, here's a point in the center of Detroit. We'll draw a big circle. It goes 30 miles in any direction. So they'll draw a big circle on the map, and they say that is a permanent tax-free zone. Within 10 years, Detroit would be the kind of rockingest city in the world. They might say it for 5 years or something. That's no good. If they said 30-mile zone, 30-mile radius, tax-free forever as long as we can hold that, Detroit would be fantastic. Same with Scotland. If Scotland's worried about losing businesses to England because of going independent, all it has to do is say, right, okay, we'll take corporation tax down to 0, and we'll have income tax 2% lower than whatever England has. Actually, that's probably a good thing they could do. They could say, we'll have the Scottish 2%. Whatever the tax rate is in England, it's always 2% lower in Scotland. Virtually every business in England that can move would move.
In Detroit, they have attempted some sort of stimulus. They've been sort of selling houses for $1, and they've been trying to pitch this to creative types and artists and people who usually don't earn high wages. I don't know if they've had much success with that, because I watched a documentary about Detroit and the water system there recently, and it still looks like a car crash.
Yes, I mean, all these initiatives are temporary, of course, because the government people there, they want to stay in permanent control with their nice big salaries that they probably give themselves. They need to get out of the way, and they need to get out of the way permanently. But they just can't see it, of course. They'd rather rule over a kind of dust heap than give up control and see somewhere, create this bastion of freedom. Can you imagine if Detroit was tax-free? It would be unbelievably prosperous within 10 years. And then every other city in America would say, what about us? Los Angeles would want to be tax-free, and Colorado and New York and everything, and San Francisco. So they won't let that happen. But that is the solution. Actually, I think I'm going to copyright that. I don't believe in copyright, of course, but I think if I did believe in copyright, I'm going to copyright my idea of the Scottish 2%. So whatever the taxes in England, we charge 2% less.
Okay, we'll put that in with a claymore then as intellectual property.
Yeah.
Well, you're talking about corporation tax there, and the government in the Irish Republic did something that was favourable to business there by lowering corporation tax. And there's a whole other debate here that we don't really have time for. But I'm aware that some people listening to this will be going, they'll be thinking about remember the controversy around Amazon, having its paying very little tax in one country because its headquarters were elsewhere. And that blew up 2 or 3 years ago. I think Starbucks was another one. And people were highly critical of this sharp practice. But those companies were within the law. And I'm not praising it. I'm not going either way. I just don't know the details. But there was a real sense of injustice around that for a lot of people who maybe hadn't looked closely at it. And I'm sure there'll be people listening to this going, oh, no, that'd be a terrible thing to do if corporation tax in Scotland is zero, then the hospitals will close or whatever it happens to be. The usual sort of thinking.
Well, then privatise the hospitals, let them become businesses that stand alone. Or sack a lot of useless government bureaucrats. You can let the hospitals go last. I mean, you can go with the Ron Paul idea where, you look after the vulnerable and the needy, but you let everyone else go. So you get rid of all these people in all these massive bureaucracies. You start cutting. All you have to do is stop printing money and living beyond your means. Just live within your means, and that will force discipline upon the Scottish government anyway. And of course, having lower taxes and sucking in all these English businesses will generate massive employment. And of course, it's better to get to 2% less and have much more business and many more people coming in and giving you jobs than it is. I mean, we saw this with the Margaret Thatcher effect in the 1970s. I know that's an evil phrase in Scotland. But, if you charge less tax rates, you actually get more tax income. Now, I'm not a fan of tax income. I don't think the government should have any tax income at all. But if they do charge less tax than England, they will get many, many more businesses and people relocating to Scotland, and they will generate much, much more income. It's one of the reasons why the British government is so worried about Scotland going independent, because they probably fear that will happen too, that many people and many businesses will relocate to a much more business-friendly Scotland. I mean, to remember, is the seat of the Scottish Enlightenment, which drove a lot of the kind of industrial revolution around the world. So it could be reborn. There could be a second Scottish Enlightenment. And I would move to Scotland. I mean, I don't know whether they'd let me in. I mean, I am a member of the clan, the Duncan clan there, or the Robertson clan, or however they disguise themselves after Culloden. But I think a lot of people would go there, and England would be the loser there.
Now, an interesting question would be, let's say the yes can't prevail. What then would be the fallout for the UK government? Sort of like what was left of it, because obviously there's Labour MPs, might be a handful, one or two Conservative MPs in Scottish constituencies, and maybe there's a Lib Dem up there, a Green, whatever it happens to be. That all changes. Those guys obviously don't have jobs anymore, not in Scotland anyway.
Well, I think the key to this is let's assume that it is yes. Well, the British government is used to people leaving it. I mean, in the 1950s, they lost the empire, they lost India, they lost all these other places around the world. They'd already lost Canada and Australia. They've lost Ireland. They're used to losing places. The British civil service can cope. It will cope. There'll be 5 years of transition or whatever, but it will be orderly. The British civil service, I mean, obviously, as a believer in a totally voluntary society, I'm not the greatest lover of the civil service, but they are good at these kinds of things, these kind of procedural things. So the transition will be smooth, much, much smoother than the no-camper painting out. But I secretly think that a lot of the Conservative MPs in the south of England want Scotland to go independent, because there are far too many MPs from Scotland. I'm not entirely sure of the figures, but I think they have 40 MPs, and I think they should only have 15. And these 40 have generally been, Darling and Gordon Brown and lots of Scottish MPs who have been Labour MPs, and they've bolstered the British government. If you look at the last few British prime ministers, we have Tony Blair, who's really Scottish from Edinburgh, although he's disguised himself as an Englishman. You got Gordon Brown, who's obviously much more obviously Scottish. David Cameron, sort of Scottish family, I think. So there's always been this I think it was part of the 1707 agreement, that to get Scotland to form the Union, they got far too many MPs. So I think the right-wing parties in England, the UK Independence Party and the Conservative Party, would become much, much stronger, because the Labour Party will basically be losing its right arm. It will be losing many of its best talents, again, I'll use quotes here, talents like Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown, and it will be losing that big ramrod of 40 MPs. So I think England would move more right into the arms of the Conservative Party, though I hope the Conservative Party is wrecked by UKIP in the next couple of years. So England will move more right politically because of this loss of these 40 Labour MPs. Scotland itself will become more free market because unless Salmond takes the nuclear option of just becoming an area within the Eurozone and actually keeps Scotland independent, then the Scottish government, even if it wants to be socialist, will be forced by all the processes we've described to become more free market. It will have to have lower corporation tax rates to keep businesses in Scotland and to attract new businesses. It will have to live within its means. That means it will have to shrink its spending because it will have to live within economic ups and downs, and it will always have to its maximum spending will always be at the bottom of the downs because it can't raise its spending in the ups because they'll have to cut the spending in the down, so they'll have an even keel of spending, which will be at a much lower level than it currently is. So even if the SNP tries to go more socialist, they'll be forced to become more free market. So Scotland will go more free market. England will go more Conservative Party, UKIP. The Labour Party will have much less effect, be much weaker. Other effects, I think Wales will finally throw off the yoke of Edward I and all those castles in Wales used to strangle Wales, and will rise up and will demand its own government too, and hopefully it will secede. And then I think London might go. I think London might try to secede. A lot of this is dependent, of course, on UKIP, because if UKIP can get what's left of the UK, which will be, I think, England and Wales and Northern Ireland. Of course, Northern Ireland, this Britishness thing will go from Northern Ireland because there won't be any more British. There'll be Welsh, English and Northern Irish. So, the Union flag will have to go. It will have to be just think of the flag. I mean, the blue background of the Union flag will have to change. So who knows what the flag of England, Wales and Northern Ireland will look like. What are we going to call it? I suppose it can still be called the United Kingdom because it will be the United Kingdom of England and the old Kingdom of Ireland, with Wales being a Principality of England. But it's going to be very, very strange. It could be very, very exciting, of course. I hope I'm wrong. I hope the yes vote wins. I hope Sean Connery is cheering on September the 19th and goes for a celebratory round of golf. I think it'd be amazing. Scotland more enterprising. England freed of the yoke of the Labour Party. Wales demanding secession. I think it's all going to be marvellous.
I hadn't thought about the flag. There's going to be a hell of a lot of pencil cases and postcards and tea towels that are going to be get offloaded cheap on eBay.
Oh, and thankfully we'll be able to get rid of all those people who complain about the Union Jack being the wrong way up. It's one less thing for that sort of person to complain about.
If this plan for secession basically fails, have we heard the last of this?
I'm very much a believer in Robert the Bruce. When he was in his cave in the Highlands or on the islands, watching his spider try and again to make its web, I think Scotland will try again. I hope they try again. Now, if it's a narrow vote, well, first of all, let's hope the Scottish independent vote wins. Okay, let's. I'll be wrong with my prediction. They'll win. That's absolutely fantastic. But even if they come a close second, they get 47, 48, I reckon the next vote will be within 10 years. If it's lower than 40, let's say it's 39 vote yes, I don't think there'll be another vote for 15 years or so. But if it's somewhere in between 48 and 39, let's say 45, I think that's sort of unstoppable. I think the momentum's there. I think in all revolutionary movements, you do not need everybody on side. I mean, the American revolutionaries were quite a small minority. Most people were just on their farms, just making a living, just trying to eke out a living from the earth. The American Revolution's main population of people, again, a very anti-tax minority of intellectuals, fed by many ideas from the Scottish Enlightenment and from John Locke and Thomas Paine. you don't need everybody. And I think 45% of people in Scotland saying they want Scotland to be independent is an unstoppable force. And I think eventually, with the old Robert the Bruce spirit of try again, they'll get there. But it just might take 10 years. But hopefully they win and get 51, and then it's game over.
If I was Scottish, or if I had the right to vote in this referendum, my inner anarchist would just say there's so many uncertainties here. There's so many unknown areas. But I would just go sod it, roll the dice, because what we have right now is so dysfunctional. Why not? Because if the yes camp do prevail, all the issues we've been talking about, they'll wake up on Friday morning, everyone will just get on with it. The shops will be open, people will be going to their office. There'll be a lot of people running around saying, okay, we need to do this and we need to do that. But the sky won't fall down.
No, I think it'll be very exciting. And I think a lot of the people who said in polls over the last 5 years, they'll definitely vote no. I think they're quite nervous at the moment because, I do have a lot of Scottish friends, and we have a banter about England all the time. But there's this constant digging of the English. And if they do vote no and they say that they don't want to be independent, then they're going to have to stop all that constant digging at the English, because they were given the opportunity to free themselves and they said no. And I think they won't want that feeling on that Friday morning of thinking, oh no, I wish I'd voted yes. And to avoid the thought of that feeling, they might actually vote yes. Even though intellectually they say no, I think emotionally, they've all watched Mel Gibson, they've all watched Braveheart, they're all brought up on Robert the Bruce and Bannockburn and the Battle of Stirling Bridge and Stirling Castle and a free and independent Scotland and Sean Connery. And they might just go in there and they might spoil their ballot papers, and they might vote yes, and they'll come out and they'll think, oh no, I wish I hadn't done that. But they'll be excited on that Friday morning if it's a yes. So it'll be a very exciting time in Scotland. And what's life without a little bit of excitement?
Well, personally, I love haggis. I love good whiskey. A good haggis, by the way. I got one in a can once and it wasn't very good at all. So good luck to the Scottish. Andy, today we've been talking about the forthcoming Scottish referendum. Before we sign off for today, tell listeners, if they want to find out, other talks that you've given, the other work that you mentioned at the top of the show, just anything else you'd like to put out there.
Well, you can just search on the internet for me. I've done some work for Casey Research. Just go to YouTube and search for Andy Duncan and Casey Research. I've mainly been an interviewer rather than somebody who's been interviewed. I've done a lot of work for a company called Gold Money. I ran some podcasts for them. I've got my own little site. It's called mithralmoney.com, where I do some financial lecturing and write the odd thought. I've got this book out under a pen name. My pen name, strangely enough, for this conversation is Jack England, and the book is Sword of Marathon. And that's a novel about the Battle of Marathon and the Greece freeing itself from the Persian yoke. So look out for that on Amazon, on Kindle, 99 pence. Sword of Marathon by Jack England, a historical novel. That was a lot of fun to do. I'm writing a sequel to that, which is, I can't reveal the name, otherwise I'd have to kill you. But I just want to come back to this secession idea. I think all of us libertarians and anarchists and believers in a totally voluntary society, we need to evaporate government. Imagine a global government. Imagine how powerful a global government would be. All the political elites in the world, all the tax eaters in the world who live off our tax and who form this superstructure ruling our lives and telling us what to do and banning us from this and banning us from that and banning us from the other thing, while making good use of those things themselves, of course. They want really to see a global government. And that would be immensely powerful and very, very difficult to shake off. Every time we halve a government, we more than halve the power of the two governments which are left over. Every time you shrink government, you have an accelerating effect on shrinking the power of the governments left over. And eventually, when we get down to no governments at all, we're all unitary governments in ourselves, we will completely evaporated the powers of coercion in the world. So we've got to do it one step at a time. We can't suddenly wake up tomorrow and have this nirvana of a totally free society. We've got to do it one step at a time, one city at a time, one country at a time. Now, again, I'm not a historicist like the Marxists who believe the forces of history will direct things in a certain way, because, that's just ridiculous. But I do believe theoretically that as we get larger governments, such as the Soviet Union and the EU, then socialism can run rampant for a while because it's got this bigger playpen to play in. But it creates these islands of chaos. And these islands of chaos, say in the EU, have destroyed Portugal, Spain, Greece, and threatening to destroy Italy and even France. And so the EU, I think, will collapse of its own accord because of this massive socialism it's engendered and this massive regulatory bureaucracy, and people will demand secession away from this mess. We saw the same thing with the Soviet Union. It collapsed in on itself. But these forces of socialism could do terrible things like create gulags and create situations where the government literally does put guns to people's head and pulls the literal trigger. So we need to avoid that. The best way to avoid that in the future is to shrink government at every opportunity. So if you're in Scotland listening to this, please vote yes and secede. Your life will be much, much better. But if you're in government or you're in this political elite and you live off tax, your life is going to be worse. And I think that's a good thing. I think people should work for a living. They should do things that people want them to do, not force themselves upon people who don't want them. So we should always work towards secession. We should always try to shrink government. Every opportunity, we should take it. We should get out of Europe with England and the UKIP. We should have Scotland independent. We should have Glasgow independent. We should have the Shetland Islands independent. We should have the Orkney Islands independent. We should have Henley-on-Thames independent.
Excellent. Well, Andy, thanks so much for joining us once again on legalisefreedom.com.
My pleasure. Speak to you again soon.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please check out the website. That's legalisefreedom.com, legalise-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalisefreedom.com.